Council, given the interest level, why don't we go ahead and do item number 4 first? So that is the shared electric mobility scooters item.
Okay.
Just would like to make a couple of quick comments as staff prepares for the presentation. First, to begin with, let's just acknowledge that this is a topic that a lot of cities across the country are dealing with, particularly those urban centers that have a lot of energy to them and a lot of growth, a lot of activity. There are lots of very strong opinions about the subject, and we've seen that across the country. And it continues to emerge almost weekly, perhaps even daily, of the creativity and the innovation that's coming along with this. It is new technologies, plural, with lots of new mobility options for our communities, for cities. At the same time, we really need to make sure that we manage the safety and accessibility elements of these programs. And so that's part of our responsibility, providing community service, to make sure that we look at those issues of safety and accessibility. Ultimately, this is as much or more a community values policy question than it is a technical one. It reflects a little bit about what we want to see in terms of our community, and so that's one of the reasons why we provided to you a variety of options. Staff is ready to implement whatever direction the council might wish to take. We have a presentation today that goes over those options, but are more than happy to make adjustments depending on what your wishes is. I'd also like to take a moment to say thank you. This is also another example of good interdepartmental cooperation. It's not just Mr. Moore, who's the transportation director, although he's going to be at the podium doing the talking. There are other folks involved as well, particularly the city attorney's office. Thank you to them, and the Raleigh Police Department, and the city manager's office. So it's again a multidisciplinary question. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Moore, our director of transportation, to go over the presentation.
Thank you, Ruffin. So today we're going to go over a little background. We'll do that very quickly, as I know most folks are very familiar with the issues around this today. A little bit about benchmarking and the proposed regulatory requirements and a structure that we would like to propose for you. Some comments about enforcement and education, and then we'll get into options and a recommendation for you. So I think it's important to state we initially saw scooters land here in Raleigh back in July, with an initial deployment of around 150 scooters. As of our most recent look, which is earlier this week, we're up to around 1,430. So you can see how popular they've been and how much we've grown in that time frame. I also think it's very important to state that currently there is no enabling action that allows either of the two operators to be here today. That's something that we hope that we can get addressed through these recommendations and the options that are here. I think we are all very familiar with the issues that we have regarding the benefits and the sort of negative aspects of how scooters have landed here in Raleigh. They provide a very popular option for folks to do short distances, but we know that they can be issues to impede some of the sidewalk spaces that we've had. Folks continue to ride on the sidewalks. And again, we're operating kind of without those kinds of regulations and that we want to have in place. There's a little bit of discussion that has occurred around this particular topic, around the legal framework that we've had. Our work with the DMV attorneys with the state of North Carolina have said that these are mopeds under their current classification. There's been a couple of papers that we've seen out of North Carolina School of Government that suggested not. There's been a few comments from state legislatures that suggest they are not. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, we are going to continue with the interpretation that we've had to date. We were recently advised, however, that the General Assembly tends to take this up in the next session at the beginning of the year, so we may get some significant clarity around that, hopefully in January, February timeframe. The regulations you're going to see today that we have, and hopefully you have a bigger set of actually a draft encroachment agreement there at your desk, were based largely on a lot of benchmarking. We did not do a significant amount of community outreach, but we did do a lot of benchmarking for cities around the country to look and see what they have done as well. We did look closely at Durham and Charlotte. Since they are here in North Carolina, they operate with a sort of similar regulatory structure. I think it's important to note that Charlotte made a very conscious decision in their pilot program to treat scooters more like bicycles rather than mopeds, just because of their similar operating characteristics. And you'll see that some of their rules and regulations are kind of reflected by that philosophical approach. We would like to recommend a master encroachment agreement as the regulatory structure that we use to permit scooters here in Raleigh. This is a system that we are very familiar with, and that we have major and minor encroachment agreements. It's not reinventing the wheel, so we have a great deal of familiarity with it. It is versatile. We would probably use this regardless of what selection process we use to find a scooter operator, whether it's an RFP or a first come first serve or any sort of defined application. It would be the action that we would use regardless. This is again, very versatile approach. And you will hear from the BPAC a little bit later about their dockless bike systems that they've looked at, that you asked them to look at earlier. And this aligns with the proposal that BPAC is going to share with you, not to steal their thunder. Part of the regulations that we suggest for you is that we would, limit the fleet size, both an overall fleet size and a minimum and a maximum fleet size for each operator. This does a couple of things for us. The maximum fleet size is a very manageable size. It is not out of line with what we've seen in a number of other cities. The fleet size for individual operators creates some capacity for some growth from another operator to come in. Currently, with 2 operators, we would have 1,000. It would create another pool of 500 for a third operator, so we're not kind of maxed out on that as well. We would foresee that as the industry matures and as our familiarity with the system matures, that we would potentially have some opportunity to increase those fleet sizes based on utilization data. We would, of course, bring that back to the council for your decisions. What you had in your initial packet in the agenda was a very high-level overview of what you would see in the master encroachment agreement. Again, we didn't want to include tons of detail in that, but very high level. The prohibitions about riding on the sidewalk would be reinforced. We would have prohibitions about certain areas where we would want to prohibit riding, for example, in parking garages, just like we do with bicycles. We want to prohibit that for safety, visibility, etc. One of the things that we included in the regulation was that no riding on the sidewalk would be prominently displayed on each scooter as a very prominent reminder to users. We have suggested that there are improvements that could be made in the front and rear lighting. I think if you actually have seen some of the newer scooters on the street, the first, we'll call it sort of scooter 1.0, some of the rear lighting on that was pretty insubstantial. The new sort of 3.0 is much better. So I think if you'll see that, you can see that the improvements have already happened there. And then we've also included some customer service requirements, a 24/7 number for customer service, direct points of contact for the city should we need to be able to move scooters and have them removed from certain areas or shifted from where they're parked, a 24/7 number that we could contact folks there as well. We have made some suggestions in terms of the regulations in regard to parking, primary amongst them, no more than 4 scooters per operator per block face. This will help with some of the alignment that you see with lots of scooters in sort of one place at one time. This would really be more for the people who establish those initial locations in the morning. So again, we can get distribution without overloading one particular business or property in a manner that would be acceptable. We have a provision to remove the scooters from the right-of-way each evening. That does not comport with one of the business models for one of the scooters that we have now, but we feel that's important in that we at least have one touch point every day where scooters are properly placed and they're in the right-of-way in the right way. I will tell you that here we suggest that the scooters be placed no earlier than 7 each morning. I've already gotten some feedback that would suggest that earlier at 6 a.m. would be beneficial for some folks who use that for commuting. They use that for that short trip to the bus stop, and that is something that we may want to consider as we prepare the final master encroachment agreement. And then we have some others about clear locations about where they can and cannot be parked. One of the things that we would want to do, again, trying to make it to work sort of on the principle of that people will do the right thing if you show them how that works, to create some areas for designated parking, maybe in some of those areas where we know that there's high pedestrian traffic and the sidewalks are already congested. Glenwood South and Hillsborough Street come to mind. these are two examples of what two other cities have done to create those parking areas where you would designate that, then sign the rest of the area to say scooter parking would be prohibited, use the designated areas. We have suggested that there would be a fee, the initial master encroachment agreement fee, but then $100 per vehicle annual fee to help support the program. That would help us put things in place like the parking that I mentioned, potentially add some bike lanes, and would also help us fund the cost of the program for staff time and enforcement. We also have some recommended special provisions around equity. One of the things that would be unique would be that we would ask for a unique identifier on each scooter so that as we have enforcement officers look to see about writing a citation for parking improperly, that it's clear as to what that scooter is, how to identify it, who to issue the ticket to. So we would have that on each scooter. We would also want to get data sharing out of the companies so we would know as we work with them and try to partner with them a little bit where we could best get some of those designated parking locations to be, plus just for us to know what are the points of pressure in the system where people want to come and go and how we can perhaps utilize this and make it work for us a little bit more efficiently. And then, of course, we have the sort of standard general provisions around insurance, indemnification, prohibition on advertising, et cetera. I know one of the big topics is how would we go about overseeing the program and managing this, particularly what kind of enforcement we would have. So we've done a lot of hard work around this in terms of program oversight. We have a bike share coordinator that would be able to pull this into their work program. We would, of course, have other resources within DOT, but we could make that work. Their responsibility would be that agreement management, follow up on the sort of data sources that we're looking at, regular checks to make sure that the deployment is correct. So we would put that into sort of her work portfolio. We also have some capacity in the parking division. We currently have a vacancy that we could use to help support downtown enforcement in the downtown area. It would work, these citations would work a lot like you would have with a parking citation on a rental car, in that we would issue them to the company. They would have some opportunity to come back to us with the name and addresses of the users that actually created the infraction. It's a little more work on our part, but it would be the way that we would follow that through. I want to be clear that we do not have the resources to do this on a very broad basis. We would be very focused and very targeted on this and concentrate primarily in the downtown area, where we know that there's probably about 2/3 to 3/4 of all the scooter usage that happens today.
Mike, if we know that we don't have enough resources, why aren't we asking for money to cover the resource need?
Ms. Crowder, we could certainly do that. We can certainly increase the fee on that if that's the will of the council. So.
I mean, if you're telling us on the front side that we don't have enough money to manage the enforcement piece or the infractions piece, then I'm not sure why we're proposing something that doesn't cover that.
Okay. The other portion of enforcement, is sort of on these broader issues of safety, particularly riding on the sidewalk itself. Our parking enforcement officers cannot issue misdemeanor citations. Those citations rest with the police department, and they will enforce as their resources allow, as circumstances demand, and we will do that to the best of our ability. Another key part of this, again, back on the principle that people will do the right thing if you make it easy for them, one of the things we want to do is beef up user education, and this is something that we would push back to some of the companies to do, to display key information in the application as people are looking at that and signing up for a particular ride. We would make that part of the encroachment agreement, that those things be included. Some of our partners, like Downtown Raleigh Alliance, have offered to help with some of that education, those sort of friendly reminders of how to properly park, potentially handing out some information about that, but they would be our partners to kind of help on that education aspect. And again, we would continue to work with our vendors to try to find the best education approach possible. Recent conversations with a couple of the companies have suggested that there are some things that they are working on to help reinforce better behaviors for parking through some self-policing and some self-enforcement activities. I think those are very promising, but the technology is not there as of yet. So to move to options for you to consider, option one, staff has suggested that we would utilize a master encroachment agreement with the 2 current operators and move to that as quickly as we can, while we then proceed to work on an RFP process that we would have in place and ready to go for operators at July 31st, 2019. You could consider this a pilot, if you will, like other cities have. This gives us a quick regulatory framework. It gets us beyond the point where we might have some General Assembly guidance. It would also give us an opportunity to do some very thoughtful engagement with the public around some options. And as Ruffin said, we are learning new things about this as it evolves every day. It would give us an opportunity to have the wisdom of the crowd in a way that we don't have if we move very, very quickly to an RFP. Option two would be for us to move quickly to an RFP, leaving the current system that we have out there today. It does not require a lot of resources to do that other than the RFP preparation, but again, we would not have the benefit of kind of what we see in terms of the evolution of the industry at the moment. Option three would have us move toward an RFP, but with the existing operators, we would issue them a cease and desist. Some of the upside to that is it gives us that time that we need to put this together. Again, we get that General Assembly guidance. Disadvantages are it removes that mobility option from the city in general. So we may have some concerns from the rider community on that. And then last would be a ban altogether. And I think that sort of speaks for itself. Staff's recommendation is that we would go with option one. And again, I spoke to a couple of those advantages to that. It would give us an opportunity for the technology, for the user community to sort of evolve and mature. We would, again, hopefully have that General Assembly guidance. We could have some meaningful stakeholder engagement around this approach. Hopefully we could be able to solicit a broader group of operators, get the best operators in the nation in a competitive manner, get some very thoughtful responses out of the RFP around some issues that, frankly, we could maybe benefit from some learning from other communities, like the equity side of things, how we do that. Is there a way that other communities are using technology a little better than we might be currently? This approach, again, with what we have in the Master Encroachment Agreement currently, and this approach would allow us to do some of the things regarded to riding on a sidewalk. We, again, have a lot of that included in that encroachment agreement. We have that information around education included in the encroachment agreement. We would continue to work with folks on issues around helmets. And again, police enforcement would be something that we would have to do as a resource availability permitted. In terms of the parking and sidewalk access, it's something we could probably move more robustly on. The encroachment agreement terms, again, are very clear about where people can and cannot park. It would require a local presence to help us address those concerns. The education side of this would be, again, included a lot in the app, but also we would be able to leverage some of our other partners in the community. And again, we would bring some enforcement resources from our parking division to bear on this as well. So with that, I'm happy to field any questions you might have, and I appreciate your patience.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
Can they be operated on the Greenway system?
Mr. Cox, no, they can't. There's a prohibition about any motor vehicle being operated on the greenways.
Okay. And then in the encroachment agreement, I didn't see where it talks about helmets. You just mentioned helmets, and I was wondering what the plan is for helmets.
The encroachment agreement references back to, it says to apply all state, local laws. So as
when I read it, it said that that passage actually referred to the scooters, not to the actual helmet.
If you look into the details in the overall master encroachment agreement, it says to apply with all state and local laws. That would suggest if we're going to continue under the interpretation of a moped, the moped helmets would be required.
Okay.
I have a few questions also, if you're done. We have gotten almost 1,000 probably emails through an app that I guess Bird put out there, and a lot of it was just standard language, and that they all said the same. But there were a number where people did add their own comments, and a lot of times that was very useful information. I feel like you've incorporated a lot of that in there, but overwhelmingly, I heard from a lot of people that they didn't think a cap was necessary. They thought market forces would really help with controlling the number of scooters, that they wouldn't be putting them out there and paying people to pick them up and recharge them if there wasn't a need for them. So can you speak to that a little bit and what you found in other places?
Certainly. So that is certainly one approach, is to let the market control that. We feel that a cap helps in a lot of ways. It creates a program that initially is more manageable for staff. Not that it's all about making it easy for staff, but it does make it more easier for us to address a lot of the concerns we hear. The other issue regarding just the cap, I would ask you to look at some of the experiences that we've seen nationally with some of the dockless bike share, where there was no cap, and then as companies found that their market returns were not great, they just abandoned what they had in place. A cap helps us manage on that side of it as well. So we don't end up with another 600 bicycles somewhere in a stack that we have to go and retrieve. So again, it keeps it at a size that we can work with. The 1,500 for the total cap is not out of line with what we've seen in several other places. Other cities may be as high, maybe unlimited, but maybe on the order of 2,250. Some start low with, again, taking the approach that as they learn, they can potentially increase that number. And again, that's sort of what we're suggesting here, that this cap may change later, but initially this would be a good place for us to start.
Okay, then I have two other questions. To me, again, the complaints and concerns that people most often are expressing are about safety, particularly with riding on the sidewalks and with where the scooters are left. And you've pointed out, obviously, we need resource if we're going to manage that appropriately. So how quickly would we be able to begin enforcing regulations, and how quickly would we be able to get some money from the company so that we can have the money to afford to do that enforcement?
I believe the enforcement, once we have the agreement in place, and that will take us a little time to work with the companies to have them make that application and to get the proper paperwork around the insurance indemnification, get all of that included and reviewed. Once we have that in place, we could probably begin some of the parking enforcement, some of the sidewalk blocking issues within a matter of weeks. Riding on the sidewalk, I would have to work with and talk with the police department about what their resources would allow for that. I would not really want to speak with them on that, but we would be able to work with them to try to figure out an approach on that as well. And I'm sorry, your second part of your question?
That was real. How soon can we get money to pay for this, the costs that we would incur as a result of this?
Yeah. So we would have to work through that through the agreement process.
Okay. Well, I think, again, given the high level of interest in this from people, both pro and con, I'd like to encourage that, we get the agreements in place as quickly as possible so that we can begin collecting money and enforcing, because, I've already heard instances where there are potential altercations with people riding on sidewalks and almost knocking other people over, and then it escalates. And I think, sooner or later, somebody's going to get hurt one way or another. And actually, I guess there have already been a number of instances where that's happened. So I think the sooner we can get this going, the better.
Understood.
You talked
Mayor?
about, I'm sorry, go ahead. Ms. Crowder.
Mayor, in terms of enforcement, what is the police thinking about their role in enforcement as it relates to our sidewalks?
Just a minute, our chief is coming down.
While she's walking down, one of the things I mentioned at the early part of this process of this new transportation mode that's out there is that we put a burden on our police department who's already strained. So in order for me to feel comfortable with this, I need to know what the solution is as it relates to the enforcement piece of this.
Good afternoon. As it relates to the police department, we are currently responding to a number of issues that arise out of the use of the scooters, to include but not limited to a DWI blocking the intersection with the scooter, several crashes, as you probably already know, injured persons involving a scooter type calls we've responded to as well. I will go back to the comment about the helmet. Your typical bicycle helmet is not what is allowed with the scooter. It is actually the same type of helmet that is required for those who ride a motorcycle. It would not be prudent for me to stand here to really talk about a list of specific violations, because I think it's also important that we evaluate each of those circumstances on its own merit. And as you can imagine, that could include anything that could relate to traffic, but really how the scooter is used by those who are riding. And we have had some criminal incidents that have occurred with the use of the scooter already, in addition to the traffic incidents. It's important to note that there is an expectation for our officers to use sound judgment when they are enforcing any type of law, and that would also include the use of the scooter as well. It's no exception to the rule. But with more than 1,000 scooters throughout the city, I think I have to be honest coming before you, and that is we do have limited resources. And the concern for me as chief is the unreasonable expectation when you have 1,000+ scooters throughout the city. While we currently are responding to those calls involving scooters, this places additional pressures on our officers who are already responding to many police-related incidents, but those that are not police-related, because there's no one else to call. As you know, we're faced with those limited resources, and it would be difficult for us to prioritize the scooters as being the #1 concern when we're dealing with matters like firearm violence, when we're dealing with mental health, and we're dealing with community engagement. However, if the council approves to continue forward with this program, you know, my plea to all of you is that there is a very strong and very heavy educational process before enforcement actually has to happen by us, because there needs to be a true plan of direction as to how we're going to deal with this and how it grows in the future. And this would assist in preventing the undermining of relationships that we're already dealing with. Part of your presentation was putting it into certain communities. Well, we have to make sure that that enforcement is reflective throughout the city. You hear that as it relates to motor vehicles and other instances. So here we are confronted with another situation that we have to be concerned about in its entirety in terms of enforcement. And last but not least, when I do talk to my peer chiefs, beyond using the scooter, as you can imagine, are those other instances where people are capturing the birds, so to speak, at the end of the day. Those who are seeking the financial resources by charging these scooters up at the end of the day and coming onto private property to take those scooters elsewhere to be charged. That's going to be where we have to play an additional role that has nothing to do with the level of enforcement that you're talking about in terms of sidewalks and helmets and those things. So however you so choose, you know the police department will support that, but I would ask that you consider all of those considerations as well.
Question.
So Mayor, what I think I'm hearing from the chief is that not are we asking them to do all the things we're asking them to do currently in their job, but we're also now asking them to enforce 1,000 more scooters as it relates to helmets, sidewalks, working through traffic signals. But we're also asking them to push out again to those pickup points, which are picked up in the evening for charging. How much are we going to put on our law enforcement before we make a decision for the profitability of a company? Where are we willing to draw the line and say, we'll do this, but you have to pay this part of that?
That was actually the next question I was going to ask Mr.
Thank you.
Moore,
I have
which
a-
is,
Sorry, so
I have a
question.
quick
I have
question
a
for the
quick
chief.
question
go
about, but go ahead.
You mentioned that the helmets is, you require a motorcycle helmet. Is that because of the classification by state law?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm fine.
So question for Chief, one quick question. So how many actual moving violations of riding on a sidewalk, how many citations have y'all given?
We've given actually 2 citations.
2?
Thus far. One is a DWI. The other is blocking the intersection. As a result of blocking the intersection, that individual was also charged with possession of a stolen firearm. We found that they've been used in the commission of a robbery, in the commission of drug sales. So as you can imagine, it's another form of mobility. So it can be used not just as it relates to traffic, but, those criminal incidents will occur, and we will address those accordingly.
Does having a cap make this more manageable for the police department, or would you support not having a cap?
I would support a cap.
okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, and this kind of ties in, you talked about charging a price per scooter, but can we charge a flat fee for the permit? In addition to?
We certainly can. You see you see that approach in many communities where there's a flat fee that's in the 5 figures. Their per scooter charge is commensurately lower, however. But yes, that's certainly another approach.
Mayor, would the flat fee accommodate our need for more enforcement on the front side as opposed to the collection side per scooter?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Wasn't there a flat fee recommended in the licensing agreement?
It's the
Application.
it is the application fee for the master encroachment agreement.
Right. It's
Mayor, I'm talking
quite
more
small.
about the terms of what you asked for. If we just charged one fee to be able to operate in our city, would it? And we went to a fee that was on the heavier side. Would that help us answer the question about the law enforcement and the ability to enforce the rules that we are looking to seek?
Ms. Crowder, I would say it could certainly help. We would perhaps need to run the sort of full cost of the program model to sort of see what that would look like in terms of how many officers, how many parking enforcement officers, how many people we're going to fully dedicate to this, and then run the sort of full cost of the service out of that to see.
I mean, I think we could, you could probably estimate for the encroachment agreement, but that could be something you could work out in finer detail during the RFP process if that's the route we choose to go.
Like that
That's
route.
correct. That's, again, part of the approach was if we were to be able to and put some rules on the ground now, collect some monies, we would then be able to see how adequate or inadequate that is and be able to make that adjustment in the RFP process.
So would the encroachment agreement be on an annual basis?
Yes, sir.
And from my understanding of option 1, which was the favorite option, is that we move forward with the encroachment agreement to kind of set the playing field, level the playing field. In the meantime, you work with the RFP to deal with a lot of these other issues as far as cost recovery. Because I looked at it, we're only talking about $50,000 right now if we only did $100 with a max of $500. That doesn't cover a lot of hours.
Well, that would be $50,000 per, if they max out, $50,000 per operator.
Right, so we're at
But 150 is a lot of money, but when you start talking about personnel, it is not. But your summary is correct, yes.
Okay.
Did anyone else?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead,
I
Ms.
was
You wanna
waiting
go
for
first?
you.
Stewart, and then Mr. Cox.
Well, I've been invited to go.
You're not
next.
Ms. Stewart?
I know, I said he could go.
Okay.
Gentleman
Just
first.
checking.
So, I've got 15 rides in so far. I may be one of the bigger riders around it. And the utility of it's fantastic for low carbon, short trip urban mobility options. Much better than me getting in a car for short trips, much better on a hot day than me getting on a bicycle. But I see plenty of areas where there are problems with riding on sidewalks. Just the durability of the equipment is a big issue. The safety features on the equipment is an issue. We got to deal with the liability, and I think your draft agreement here is going to take care of a lot of that. What I would like to do is think about this RFP. Now, the option one, which I support, it proposes this RFP would go out in the middle of next year, and I just would want to make sure that when you're working on that RFP, that council has an opportunity to weigh in, and citizens too, for that matter, and say, okay, here are the additional features that we'd like to see, because we really have an opportunity to, through this RFP, to incentivize any vendor to come forward and innovate and compete to give us the best possible scooter system for the city of Raleigh. And so what I'd like to do is suggest that we ask staff to bring back just an outline of what an RFP might look like. And I talked with the mayor about this, and so I've handed out a sheet, just my initial ideas about what sort of RFP items would be like, so we could give vendors the idea of what our criteria for success are, so they could bring back RFPs, so we could draft an RFP and they could bring back ones that really meet our needs. So I'll just point to a couple. The very last one is, I've seen what some of the providers are doing in other cities, that they're actually proposing to help fund infrastructure, bike infrastructure in the city, to help fund bike lanes and help fund these racks. The other one is the next to the third from the bottom, which is very interesting. Well, I've just seen how the scooters are tremendous liability being left in the public right on sidewalks. And what they're doing in DC is they're requiring the vendors to come up with a technique, and it sort of looks like a bike lock. So they actually, when they put them out in the morning, they're locked to a pole or a rack or something like that. And likewise, at the end of the ride, they'd be relocked so that there wouldn't be they wouldn't be left in the middle of the sidewalk, wouldn't be falling over and being tripping hazards. But I would just want to make it a statement in the performance standards for the RFP to say, here are all the things we'd really like you to look at that haven't been addressed in our initial agreement that could help us get the best possible service for our citizens. So that list is here.
I'd like to add to that list one item. Something I've been reading about recently is that some of these companies are starting to experiment with variations in their program. Rather than just dropping the scooters on the streets or at designated locations, some are actually thinking about experimenting with delivering these to riders at their homes. Mm-hmm. So if there's a way that we can capture in the RFP variations in different kinds of programs, that would also be useful, I think.
My request then of council is that we ask staff to, perhaps the next meeting, come back with an outline of considerations for an RFP, so that you can share your thoughts with us, we can share our thoughts with you, and so as you're working towards a full RFP, that we'll make sure that you don't get a bunch of work done and come back and we say, no, that's not what we wanted, or here's the other things that you didn't think of. So that would be my request.
Okay. My question to you is that 2 weeks?
It's not a lot of time, but
No.
But it's just an outline.
Well,
I mean, this.
So we really have two things going on. One is the encroachment agreement, and then the other is the RFP.
correct.
Right.
If we can get the encroachment agreement agreed upon today, then maybe we can give them 4 weeks to come back with the outline.
And Mayor, Mr. Stevenson said one thing I just want to make sure. The approach would be that we would start on the RFP very soon, mm-hmm. that it would not start in July.
I understand.
Right.
The idea it would conclude. So I've heard that out in the popular conversation a lot, that would be, starting in July. I just want to make sure that folks are clear that we would be ready to have something, to have operators ready to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, my intent is understanding that it will take some time to get the full RFP together, but that just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of the criteria that we think we'd like to see to provide the best possible service. So we're all in agreement before you spend a lot of time on the RFP. So
certainly
the,
welcome
Mayor?
input.
Yes.
Where did we come up with the $290 for the encroachment agreement?
Can we come and agree on a 4-week to bring an outline on the RFP?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll second
Wait,
that
wait,
if it's a
let's-
motion.
I have quite a few comments
Okay.
and thoughts I'd like to share. One is I'm not real excited about an RFP. I do want to kind of bring back the conversation for a moment. There seems to be a lot of focus on the negative aspects of scooters, of the safety concerns, and kind of paint this with a bit of perspective of what we allow to operate in our city day to day and take for granted. So those being your 2 to 5 ton vehicles that are causing deaths every day, that are causing accidents, that are blocking our sidewalks, that are costing our police tons of resources, our city tons of resources. And so I just want to take a moment and own that, that there's this new transportation technology out there. And one of our community values is getting more people on bikes and walking and on other transportation that's not cars. We're talking about transit and investing tons of money in that. And here we are debating about where we're going to park these things. And I'm just really kind of frustrated with where the conversation's going instead of embracing a new technology and really being the city we want to be. And so that being said, I've talked to a couple of council members about not being excited about an RFP. But focusing on the licensing agreement, I'm sorry, I'm getting the term wrong, but the agreement, there are a few things I want to bring up to make sure that kind of these thoughts are considered before we move forward. One is, and Michael, you mentioned this, changing the times of operation, so starting earlier. I have not heard any complaints whatsoever about what times we are currently seeing these things go out. Around 6 a.m., and most of them have to be up by 9 p.m. I think that 10 p.m. window is more kind of on the flex side, it sounds like, from our enforcement end. I'm really concerned about a cap of 1,500 when we're already at 1,430. And if we're really interested in making sure that these reach other areas of our city outside of downtown as an equity component, then placing that cap means that's it. And I understand that we can come back and reevaluate that, but I have concerns with that. I also have concerns about kind of restrictions around where we are saying we can't park these. So at bus stops and shelters, and it sounds like maybe one of the places that we're saying in this agreement that we can't park them is at bus stops and shelters, and it sounds like we just need to maybe clarify some of the language around that.
That's correct. I think the approach would be we do not want them within the shelter or in front of the bench, but adjacent in some area would be appropriate. And that, again, might be a place where some modest amount of infrastructure, a line on the sidewalk that we could say scooter parking here would be helpful to help people do the right thing.
I think that would be great. I'm also concerned about not allowing parking on streets with no sidewalks. Actually I live on a street with no sidewalk, and know a lot of folks who also don't have sidewalks in front of their homes. And so how are we limiting their ability to use scooters in their kind of access to mobility?
Well, can I ask what the reasoning behind that was?
A number of the streets that have no sidewalk have no obviously no hardscape.
Right.
We've seen them end up parked in the street rather than in a lawn space particularly.
Okay.
So it was a way that we could make sure that they ended up in a neat, orderly fashion, not in the street, not across someone's front yard.
Okay.
We've also had issues with them, the only hard space being someone's front door access that comes out, so they get left in those locations.
So I wonder if an alternative might be, in addition to where we can't park them, where we can park them, being between the street and a sidewalk or the first foot or two of your property, to make collection easier.
Yeah, we would certainly appreciate any input you have on that. So.
Well, I'll just jump in and I'll say I agree that we don't need to prohibit them on streets without sidewalks. There is public right-of-way behind the curb. It's available. I just again, a frequent user, the first end of the trip I end up walking a few blocks to find one, but on the trip back, I want to ride it to the end of my driveway and leave it right there. And, and then guess what? They come every evening, they pick it up and put it right back where they want to. And so if I lived on a street without a sidewalk, but I wanted to use the vehicle, I wouldn't want to leave it several blocks away and walk the last several blocks to my house especially if I knew it was going to get picked up and carried away at the end of the day anyway.
Well, we'll take that back and see if we can finesse that a little bit.
Which is one thing I love.
And one
Picking
thing
them up at the end of the
from
day.
an equity standpoint, I've seen scooters all the way out in Battle Ridge. And Battle Ridge is closer to Knightdale than downtown Raleigh. So the scooters are getting around.
Oh, yeah, they are.
So
What access to mobility?
So that's one thing that I'm definitely seeing. But safety. Safety is my biggest concern. And even as we work on the encroachment and agreement, getting it out, we have to make sure that we have a hardcore press from these companies from a safety standpoint. I'm hearing conversations of, really teaching people that a stop sign if you're on a scooter and you come on the street with a stop sign, you got to stop too.
Same thing goes for bikes.
And bikes as well. You have to stop because I'm hearing someone called me 2 weeks ago and said almost hit 2 people because they cut through and they didn't stop. So I'm saying this really not directly at you. You're at the podium, but this is for everyone that's out there with the social media, the cameras, and everything. We have to be safe. It's very possible that a few people being reckless could cause things to just disappear. And I'm just being truthful and upfront. Because I don't want us to say, oh, because somebody died, now we're removing these scooters.
We don't remove
Let's not. I hear you about the cars, but if I'm in Garner and I'm trying to get to Crabtree, I'm not taking a scooter.
No, you're not, but you are looking out for other vehicles on the road, and that should include scooters and bikes, as well as pedestrians.
Councilman Stewart, I've never interrupted you.
That's fair.
So, as I'm saying, we have to be respectful users of these scooters. We have to be. And that message is something I want to push out there. And we have to make sure these companies are willing to help pay for the costs of making sure people are safe.
I'd just like to add.
Wait. Are you finished?
I'm not finished.
Okay, let her finish, then Mr. Thompson asks, and then you.
On the kind of picking up on Councilmember Branch's safety comments, I think the complete ban of riding on sidewalks actually brings more safety issues. I do think we should be banning them on sidewalks in the downtown core, over near Glenwood South, and kind of our more concentrated urban areas where we have more folks using the sidewalks for walking. There are a lot of areas where we don't have bike lanes, where we have much faster moving traffic, and there aren't a lot of people on sidewalks. Six Forks on the way from Wake Forest to North Hills being an excellent example. You have very narrow lanes, very fast-moving traffic, and not a lot of people on sidewalks. But if we could allow scooters to ride on those sidewalks, all of a sudden you're activating neighborhoods to be taking scooters or bikes to North Hills instead of getting in their cars. So I want us to kind of consider that, not necessarily banning scooter use on sidewalks outside of kind of those downtown core areas.
I'm sorry, that's a problem for me on Hillsborough Street.
I mean, I'm happy to take scooters off sidewalks on Hillsborough Street, assuming there's a bike lane.
Well, and I'll agree that Raleigh it's difficult with the range of different kinds of streets, some that are low speed, some that are high speed, some have bike lanes, some that don't. I guess my sense is that it's going to be almost impossible to come up with a customized set of rules about where you can and can't, and it'll fall to where we think it's important to enforce riding on sidewalk rules, and that would. So I don't see an easy answer to say on a high-speed street you just won't ever get to use a scooter there if there's a ample sidewalk there.
Okay, Mr. Stevenson.
Certainly one we'll have to work through.
Are you finished?
I also really love Durham, what Durham put out yesterday around equity, and think that's something we should strive for. There's a lot around language access of these apps, making sure that we have multiple languages that folks can read on the apps, considering, and this is more kind of further down the road, but considering dropping the age to 16. You can get a permit to drive a car, but you can't get a permit, or you can't drive a scooter, which is technically a kid's toy, as well as licenses, making sure we're not discriminating against folks who can't get licenses.
Okay,
Ms.
Mr.
Stewart
Thompson.
finished?
Just a minute, Mr. Thompson, and then Ms. Mendel, and then you, Ms. Crowder.
So, did I hear you say, Michael, that it would be not legal for the scooters to be in the bike lanes right now?
Mr. Thompson, that's correct, and that I'm sorry I failed to mention that that is an issue that we'll have to bring back to you for an adjustment in the code to permit that to happen if we go forward. So.
Okay. Well, I think we will have to do that because I definitely do not feel that the scooters should be allowed on any sidewalks. I mean, I hate to say this, that I told you so, but I told you so. Wow. This problem is out of control. These folks riding these scooters, you talk about more education. How much more education when you need when it says do not ride on the sidewalks? They've been doing this for 4 months and blatantly disregarding those instructions. And we've had accidents. People have been hurt. Thank God no one's been killed. So we need to get a grip on this now. And I think the only way you're going to get people to stop from riding on the sidewalks is start writing tickets. And we already have an ordinance where folks that would ride them on there is going to be getting a $50 ticket, but our chief has our police department's only written 2 tickets, and neither one of those, it sounds like, were from riding on the sidewalk. So we've got to get enforcement here, and I think $100 per bicycle, per scooter is not enough because the taxpayers should not have to burden themselves for paying for this, for these companies to come in here at our expense. So they need to bear the burden of the cost because we've got to increase staff, we've got to increase more police department, we've got to start writing tickets for the offenders. Until they stop doing that, we run the risk of someone getting hurt or killed. So I'd like to make the motion then that we go for option 1, that we increase the fee per scooter to $150, and that we have an RFP out by December 1st, December 15th at the latest. June is too late. But we need to get this encroachment agreement in place now.
Just a few amendments. We do allow them to put the scooters out at 6 a.m. rather than 7 a.m.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I did want to mention, I don't think I saw it in the agreement, but I've heard from a lot of people who are concerned that when they see groups of the scooters parked outside elementary schools and middle schools, and, you know, a lot of people say, oh, well, children can't unlock them, but apparently a lot of parents are unlocking them for their children. And I just think the idea of kids in elementary school and middle school being tempted with, you know, several scooters parked nearby their schools is just not a good thing.
I would add looking at having that permit fee be substantial to help us covering
Yes.
the expenses.
Would you like to offer any guidance on that?
Well,
or have us come back and
Seattle's permit, now I thought it was dockless scooters, but it's dockless bikes. It's $250,000 to do business in the city per company. Now, I don't think we're
I
there,
like that.
but
I think it should be a minimum of $150,000.
It also sounds like we still have a lot of questions and debating to do on this. Like,
well, we're talking about, I think we do too, but we're talking about the encroachment agreement, which we need to get done pretty quickly.
Mayor,
Yes,
can I go now?
yes, go ahead.
So I agree with you. We need to go ahead and get the encroachment agreement, but there seems to be a lot more conversation that needs to happen. So I'm going to make a suggestion and a motion after we vote on Mr. Thompson's motion that we move this conversation to transportation. But I also want to make just one more observation. It's sobering to listen to this conversation where we have some people who are interested in the enforcement side, some people are interested in the safety aspect of it, and then other council members who want everything they want because they want it because it's a good thing to do for mobility. So obviously the council has a lot more decisions to make. So when Mr. Thompson's motion is enacted on or voted on, I'd like to make a secondary motion.
Okay, I think Mr. Thompson made a motion.
That's the one she wants.
He did.
She wants to go after.
I seconded.
Yeah, she seconded.
Had one motion on the floor to come back within 4 weeks
Well,
with
that,
an RFP.
well, okay.
All right,
But
let's
You know what?
let's
I'm
stop,
going to
stop.
withdraw.
Let's just talk about the encroachment agreement. So how much more, you know, they put one in front of us. We've talked about the changing the times. We've talked about next to transit. We've talked about, I mean, my suggestion would be look at what other cities charge for the ability to get the operating permit. What else in the encroachment agreement, not the RFP, what else in the encroachment agreement, looking at what staff has already proposed, are people concerned about? We talked about the streets with no sidewalks. Maybe we allow them to park within the first 2 feet of the curb.
Changing the start time to
Changing the times to 6 to 9. Was there anything else in the encroachment agreement?
Just the clarification about the fee.
A clarification about the fees. I'm just trying to allow staff to go ahead and move on that, because that obviously has a lot to do with our liability issues too. Okay. Can I get a motion to move forward on the encroachment agreement with those items?
So moved.
second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So let me throw one thing at you for the RFP. There's a lot of things out there that we don't know. You know, like you talked about in Washington, D.C., where they're required to lock themselves. Would it be helpful to do an RFI and get all that information in first and then to do an RFP, or is that too prolonged a process? Do you feel like you can still do it with an RFP?
Madam Mayor, I feel like we can still do it with an RFP.
Okay.
Perhaps not in 4 weeks, but we can do it with an RFP.
Well, I think in 4 weeks, what we were asking for was just to see the outline. So all the things we've talked about here, everybody can just kind of see, yes, you've covered all the things that have been popping up are important, and then run with it.
Certainly.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Is everybody okay with that? Yes. Okay. Do we,
that a
except for Nicole, who doesn't want to do an RFP at all.
Correct.
So here's a question for the attorney. If you have a master encroachment agreement, do you still need an RFP?
Well, the master encroachment agreement, I think, would be in place the way it's proposed for a year, and then when you had an RFP, it would, you could terminate at will, and you go to the next, whoever the qualifying people
No,
would be.
I'm saying, can you structure the encroachment agreement in a way that it eliminates, I mean, if you don't qualify with if you can't agree to what's the encroachment agreement, you can't play.
Yes.
Mayor,
So what's the
Yeah.
difference? What's the RFP part?
can I help, try to jump in here a little bit? Let's clarify one thing. The direction that you're giving us on the encroachment agreement part, we need to go back and we would bring back that for an
Right.
official approval, perhaps at the next meeting if the vendors were to agree. You still have to approve officially the master encroachment agreement.
Right.
Then separately, your question is how you're going to structure and process the RFP selection. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to clarify that we have to bring back an official action to approve the agreements with
Okay.
the vendors.
And then how about we take Ms. Crowder's recommendation and put the RFP into the Transit Committee and look at it there?
Well, he's going to bring it back to the full council first,
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have it
and then
yet.
we can decide.
Okay.
Do we need a motion on that too?
I have one question. I need a moment of clarity. Is the RFP the outline that's been requested to have back in a few weeks? Is that what we're voting on now?
That would be the second vote, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so the second vote, do we have to vote on that, or are we just asking?
What I heard was that within 4 weeks, we'll bring back to you at a council meeting an outline of an RFP process and criteria.
Okay.
Okay.
But we've already voted to move ahead with the encroachment agreement, so we can get that in place quickly. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did
Thank you.
they have yet another motion?
I think we covered it with
I
that.
think we just covered
We
them all.
covered it.
Thank you
Okay,
very much.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, everybody that
Thank you.
came down.
Thank you for the work, Michael.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Okay, Mr. Manager.